So I guess it's my pleasure to welcome those people who've logged in so far to the Plant Phenome Journal webinar. This is the fifth in the series. We try and have a webinar the first Monday of each month, unless there's a holiday, as there is in the case of this month. Our past speakers have included a diverse array of crop scientists, plant biologists, engineers, computer experts, and some of those have been successfully recorded. And the successfully recorded ones will continue to be placed up on the website. Now, next month's the Plant Phenome Journal seminar is going to be February 5th, and that's actually going to be Kari Hugi from USDA ARS, and she's located in South Carolina, looking at NDVI technologies in cotton. So, Mr. Ace Pugh, he's in Dr. William Rooney's program, and he's going to be discussing using UAVs to develop temporal growth curves in both sorghum and maize. I'll remind everybody before I get started to please mute your microphone, and when we get close to the end, I'll take questions, and you can either unmute or type your questions in the chat box. If you do have any technical difficulties, do please feel free to type whatever issue you have in that chat box there. Okay, and so without further ado, Nicholas Ace Pugh, please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for that introduction. So yeah, today I'll be speaking to everyone about my our research paper that is going to be published in the Plant Phenome Journal, and it's entitled "The Temporal Estimates of Crop Growth in Sorghum and Maize Breeding Enabled by Unmanned Aerial Systems." So we talk a lot these days about the need for high throughput phenomics, because phenotyping is actually kind of a bottleneck in many crop breeding programs, including sorghum and maize. But remote sensing via unmanned aerial systems could help address this, and resources and technologies used by other disciplines could also be utilized to improve results. And the impetus for this is that global climate change and projected population increases are becoming a challenge for many disciplines, including breeders. And Africa and Asia are the biggest concern, as you can see at the right. So, as plant breeders, how do we answer this call? So, at Texas A&M, we actually have a large multidisciplinary project that has been organized around unmanned aerial systems. And this project has many different experts working together. And this includes computer scientists, engineers, and field researchers that work with them. So this multidisciplinary project has enabled researchers to conduct complex studies in an efficient and collaborative manner. Now, we're looking at many different traits in sorghum and maize at this university. This is not an exhaustive list at the left, but it is a few of the traits that are being investigated. But for this paper, we chose to focus on plant height. So why did we want to focus on plant height? Well, it's a trait of great importance to maize and sorghum producers, and it's been shown to correlate pretty strongly to grain yield in maize and sorghum. Another benefit is it's not as genetically complex as many other characteristics like the ones that I showed you. And as an additional benefit, it's very simple and repeatable to manually measure in the field. So ground truth measurements are pretty reliable for this trait. So when we're evaluating UAS for their use in a breeding program, the focus isn't really on finding the absolute correct height for an individual plot. It's more important that we find the relative heights of various genotypes and that is accurate. So as breeders, we're most interested in the genetic variation that can be explained by these techniques, the repeatability, and high correlations, of course, are also important to breeders. But I think the most important thing is our ability to differentiate between plots accurately. If you say one plot is taller than another, the UAS also has to say that plot is taller than the other. It's not as important that the UAV is able to say that it is 50 inches exactly. And another benefit of using UAVs is that you can generate temporal plant growth curves. So this is an example of how this can be done, showing 3 different varieties for maize. You can actually identify genotypic growth patterns or stress resistance within your varieties. So if you look here, where my pointer is, you can actually see a period where maybe there was some drought stress in this material. And you can also see kind of a crossover point where the red variety kind of lags behind, but eventually ends up at a similar spot as the green. And even more interestingly, you can see how early growth in the blue actually was lower, but it ended up being the tallest of the 3 varieties. So these are kind of interesting observations that are allowed by looking at these growth curves. So now I'm going to talk about the methods of this specific paper. So our ground truth measurements, they were conducted by measuring at the apex and the whorl of the plant when the plant was young, and the flag leaf and the panicle tip when the plants were mature, or the top ligule. So the estimated mean of the plot in sorghum was used. So by that I mean that we held up a stick at the front of the plot and kind of took an estimated mean down by looking down the stick down the plot. And for maize, representative plants were chosen within the plot. For the measurements, barcode scanners were used to record the height. And at the right, you can see a picture of kind of how we do our manual height measurements using a height stick. Now, this is the experimental design for the project. There were basically that we had 4 different tests of material, 2 for each crop. And you can see that they were all measured using different rotary wing UAS. I believe that it was a Phantom 3 in College Station and a Phantom 4 in Corpus Christi. And there's 2 sorghum tests, as I said. There's the advanced sorghum test, which is composed of elite hybrids, and the early generation test, which is composed of early generation hybrids, as the name suggests. For maize, it was the same material, but it was planted at different time points. So we had an optimal planting that was earlier and a late planting that was later in the season. Now, the late planting was only planted in College Station, not in Corpus Christi. Now, this is just a slide just to kind of show what we mean by advanced and early generation. This is a basic schematic of the sorghum breeding program at the left. And as you can see, the advanced hybrids are basically material that has reached the end of the pipeline. So it's the most elite grain material. The early evaluation hybrids are a lot earlier in the pipeline. So basically, you would expect the early evaluation hybrids to have a bit more variation between plots. But the advanced test is a lot closer to what producers would actually grow. Now, I'm not going to go too into the weeds about how the UAV side of this project was done, but on a basic level, the way that heights were estimated was by using digital surface models that were generated using structure from motion. So this is kind of just a slide to kind of show how you could have an aerial image, and then after mosaicing many of these images together, you can eventually generate a heat map like the one at the right. So in this case, red are plots basically indicate taller plots. And this is a kind of a slide showing a cross section of a plot from the side. So the plants are basically here. And as you can see, there were different percentiles that were taken from this UAV data. And you can see here's the maximum and then the 95th percentile. I just wanted to show this so that we have kind of an idea of what these measurements mean later in this presentation. So there were two flight teams, as I said, and there was one in College Station that was ran by Dr. Popescu and Dr. Malambo. And then there was one in Corpus Christi that was run by Dr. Jung, Dr. Chang, and Dr. Maida. Now you can see over to the right is a supplemental table for our paper that just kind of shows when the flights were conducted and when the accompanying ground truth measurements were conducted. But I'm going to condense that for you and just say we had 7 dates for Sorghum that overlapped and 4 dates for Maize and College Station. So basically that's how many dates we had that we could actually make comparisons between the two methods. And then in Corpus Christi, we had 5 dates for each of these crops. So as I said before, the focus when we're evaluating these UAVs isn't really whether or not they're getting the exact correct height of a plant. What we want to know is what the genotypic variation explained is, how the repeatability is, and whether the correlations are high enough to be useful. So with that, I'm going to get into the meat of this discussion, which is the results that we found. So first I want to present the variation explained. So as you can see, the UAS actually reached similar or higher levels of genotypic variation explained compared to the ground truth methods on a whole. This is true in both crops, both locations, depending on the percentile that you use. As you can see, the maximum percentile was a little bit weaker in maize, but they were pretty similar in sorghum on a whole, especially in the early generation. I would say the UAV, both percentiles performed pretty well. So for sorghum, the ground truth methods are actually unable to tease out any genotypic variation on the first flight day. So this was pretty early in growth, over at 49 days after planting. That's what the dates are, is the days after planting of the crop. You can see over here that the genotypic variation explained by our ground truth methods was actually minuscule. But the UAVs actually, especially in the early generation, were able to at least explain a decent portion of it. Now, we quickly caught up on the ground truth afterwards. Another thing to note here is that the early generation actually had way better genotypic variation explained for all measurements. Now, the reason for that is like I was saying before, the early generation material is actually a lot more variable from plot to plot because it's earlier in the breeding process. So we would expect to see these results. It follows suit that in the elite test or in the advanced test composed of elite material that you would see a lot less being explained by genotype, because at that point your error is going up. And for maize, I think what we actually found here is that the 95th percentile was superior for both tests, for the early and late material. So it looks like the max actually performed much worse, especially in the late planting. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what the reason for that would be, but it is interesting nonetheless. So to sum that up, UAS explains similar levels of genotypic variation to the ground truth methods in both crops, and are actually superior at teasing out this variation early on in sorghum. They're a bit weaker than ground truth methods at capturing genotypic variation early on in maize, though. But they do quickly catch up as the growth cycle proceeds, especially if you're using the 95th percentile. Now, from these results, we also calculated repeatability estimates. There's not too much to say here other than that the repeatability was pretty high throughout the growing season. Interestingly, though, just as we saw before, the ground truth methods in sorghum early on were not able to achieve very high repeatabilities. So what we see from this is that the UAV can actually be used a lot earlier than ground truth methods to get reliable measurements. So that's kind of interesting that you have access to this early growth. Now, the reason that we probably had lower repeatabilities is because the plants were very short then, and they hadn't even emerged from the whorl. So basically, there's so much error involved in those measurements because you're bending down and trying to measure these plants that are waving around in the wind. So I think that's a big part of why those ground truth repeatabilities are so low early on. But overall, the UAVs in both crops were able to stand with the ground truth measurements. Another focus of this paper was to conduct correlations within each of the tests. Now, this is an overview of it, and you can see that the correlations in general range from moderate to high, depending on the material and depending upon the percentile of the point cloud that you use. Now, in sorghum, the correlations were higher in the early generation tests, which follows from the results of the variation explained. Basically, there were bigger height differences between plots, so you would expect the correlations to be a little bit higher for that test. The 95th percentile measurement was superior to the max percentile in the early generation, but it was the opposite in the advanced. I'm not really sure why that would be, but it is kind of interesting. So it must be something about what the point cloud is actually measuring on each of these groups of material. The 95th percentile was superior in College Station for maize, but both percentiles actually performed pretty similarly in Corpus Christi, as you can see at the right. The correlations were more consistent with the optimal test than with the late planting test in College Station. As you can see with the optimal, it kind of stays somewhat level throughout the growing season, whereas there's wide swings in correlation for the late planting. I'm not sure. I think that this could probably just be because maybe the optimal test was healthier. Maybe, I mean, there's a lot of possible reasons that this could be the case. Now, this is actually kind of the biggest focus of this paper was to try to think, how can we actually apply these methodologies once we've actually validated them? And the way that we thought would be a good application was to try to construct these multi-temporal growth curves. So you can see here the growth curves that were generated for sorghum. So on the top you have the advanced sorghum tests, and at the bottom you have the early generation tests. And this is all the genotypes in those tests. And you can kind of see different points, especially towards the end, and especially in the early generation tests, where maybe you had crossovers between the materials like I showed you earlier. So if you look where my pointer is, you can actually see how this dark green variety actually kind of basically fell behind the others. I'm not really sure. That could be because of lodging or any number of things. But it is kind of interesting that you see this decrease in a lot of these genotypes towards the end of the season. Now, this growth curve was actually constructed using 3 different UAVs. It was constructed using an EB, solo UAV, and the Phantom 4 that was used for the rest of the study. And basically, the way that this was done was the other 2 supplemental UAVs were added in between the flight dates of the Phantom 4. And even in here, and I should say this is the growth curve for Maize and Corpus. Now, as you can see here, there's this decrease in heights shown in all 3 of the UAVs towards the end of the growth season. So the question is, what is going on here? Why are the plants decreasing in height? Because we see this in all the genotypes, so it's not something as simple as UAV error, because there's many flight dates within here, within this section. So the growth curve constructed for Maize demonstrates that multiple UAS platforms can work well together. And the shrinkage of the plants that was observed after flowering took place in either crop could be due to many possible factors. However, to determine if actual stalk shrinkage takes place, further studies would need to be conducted, because there's a lot of other more mundane explanations for why there was a decrease in height. You could have basically desiccation of plants, you could have leaves that start drooping, you could have tassels that droop, you could have lodging within plots. There's a lot of different possible explanations, but it is, I think it would be worth looking into maybe if there could be actual shrinkage of plants in the future. So, in conclusion, I think what we see here is that UAS are highly repeatable, and they can generally measure similar or higher amounts of genotypic variation as the traditional methods. They also have high correlations with the ground truth height measurements in the variable materials, so in the early generation materials. They're not able to discern between genotypes in the advanced sorghum as well. This is likely due to the lower genotypic variation between plots in that test. Multi-temporal growth curves, as shown, can be a highly useful tool for plant breeders, and they could actually help to elucidate new information about crop growth. Even if there is no plant shrinkage, it's still pretty informative to know where these crossover events happen, how your genotypes responded to stressors. So I think that as this technology gets used more and more, these techniques are going to be introduced into, they're going to be used as a standard practice in breeding programs. So future objectives, I think logical points to go next would be to assess UAS for their ability to phenotype other traits of interest, any of the ones I mentioned before, or there's probably a bunch of other ones that people could think of also. I think the sky's kind of the limit for what we're able to test out right now. We could generate similar growth curves for other important phenotypic characteristics. So we could look at things like biomass yield or disease, etc. And eventually, I think integrating UAS height measurements into standard plant breeding studies, as I said, will be the norm. And beyond that, I think a logical next study would be to try to start looking at intra-plot variation. So basically, plants within plots. Can you see sections of plots that are diseased or maybe that lodge while the rest of the plot's healthy? With a UAV, it's a lot easier to trim that portion of a plot out and try to just look at the healthy portions of a plot. And that's just one example of something you could do with that. So I would like to thank everybody that contributed to this project. This is not an exhaustive list of the people that contributed, but these are maybe the key players that made this project happen. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Ace, for your exciting seminar explaining your paper on height estimates. And I'll just remind everybody that paper is now online in the first look section. It should be, since it's a new journal, it's taking us a little bit longer to get it translated from the first look into the final print version, but it's online now. So what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for the next, Ace finished quite early, so for the next 15-20 minutes for some questions. So the way that we usually do questions is you can either write it into the chat section in your browser, or you can unmute if you turn down your volume to minimize feedback and just when there's an opening, jump in. So while you're preparing those questions, I'm going to make a plug, as I always like to do, for the Plant Phenome Journal. So ACES is the first peer-reviewed article that came through, and thanks to editor Dan Northrup for getting that handled quickly. I know we have another one, which is going to be our speaker for next month. And there's a couple others that are hopefully going to be confirmed in the next few weeks, and that should give us our next few speakers. But we're anxiously awaiting additional submissions. So this is a Tri-Society journal that's really dedicated to advancing these issues. And I believe we're still accepting articles at reduced cost. So there's my plug. That hopefully gave people time to think about questions. I'm going to ask or make a comment, maybe more than a question. But you kind of off the cuff mentioned max and 95% ACE, but I don't think I don't think, unless I missed it, you really explaining that for people who aren't familiar with it. You want to share a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. Let me go to the slide. That might also help. So basically, from the digital surface models that were generated, you have this 3D point cloud of each plot. And basically the percentiles are the amount of that point cloud that was used for the height estimate. So the maximum measurement, or the percentile, is basically all of the points in that point cloud making up your height estimate, while the 95th would be the 95th percentile of that point cloud being used. Does that help at all? It's kind of like this picture shows.
So then we could imagine that there's a 90th percentile and a 75th percentile.
Yeah, there would be any number, but we basically chose these percentiles because they perform the best for this study.
And you said that the maximum plant height worked almost as well in sorghum, but it worked a lot more poorly in maize. But I don't think you really clarified what the cause of that might be. You have some ideas of why that might be?
Yeah, I don't have any definitive cause, but if I was just listing possible causes, maybe one would be something about the tassel throws it off. Maybe because I'm not really sure. It's kind of something that it's something that would probably need to be looked at more closely to really tell.
Okay, and Justin asked, is each of those peaks a single plant or a single plot?
This is basically a side view, so each of these is a plant.
And based on those hills of the ground, I'm guessing you're looking down a row. Basically, the water would flow in those furrows between plots. Is that?
Well, I think it's a side view of a plot. So basically, these aren't the furrows between plots. I think that's it's just the plant, basically.
Oh, I see.
The ground near the plant, if that makes sense.
So then on the left-hand figure, that gap is likely to be the alley between one plot and the next plot.
Yeah.
Potentially. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that answers Justin's question. Jeff Mullen asks, did ground truth data on plant height show the same reductions as UAS data, or is this an artifact of aerial imagery?
The ground truth data didn't really show those same reductions, which is why I think that it's probably due to these other factors. So basically, when we measure the plants, we're not really using the leaves or anything else when we're taking our measurement. So if your leaves are decreasing, yeah, exactly. If your leaves are decreasing, the UAV is going to pick up on that, but the ground truth method might not. So I think that's why you see this decrease. I think it's probably mostly attributable to these plants decreasing, well, basically the canopy is decreasing because the leaves are starting to senesce.
Okay. Sergey asked, did the UAS height variation reflect the variation in grain yield for sorghum? So was there, I think that question is maybe getting at if there was a correlation between height and grain yield?
There typically is, but I don't think we've actually looked at that yet. We haven't really looked at the grain yield data too much yet for those tests.
Okay.
So
but was there a variation? Maybe the better way to think about this is, was there a variation between genotypes? Was the height variation similar to the variation seen in the grain yield?
Oh yes. There was a large amount of variation for grain yield within these tests, especially for the early generation tests.
Okay. Justin asks, as leaves senesce, the 95th percentile will be lower, which could explain the decrease in height over time. Mm-hmm. It's very unlikely that stem height itself decreases appreciably.
I mean, I agree. Okay. I basically offered stalk shrinkage. I think is an outside possibility that we can't say that that's the reason until somebody actually looks into it. I think that he's probably right that the decrease is probably more of a result of how the UAV measures height. So basically, because of the leaf senescing, your 95th percentile goes down. I agree completely with that statement.
Yeah, I think you put that well. That it's unlikely, but you can't rule it out. And
right.
I think I would also suggest that I don't think anybody's really looked at that. And you can imagine a plant under high turgor pressure that then senesces and doesn't have that turgor pressure anymore. Could experience some shrinkage, but that's probably less than a UAV would pick up.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting future study for somebody to do. Because I think until we actually look into whether or not there's stalk shrinkage, there's just no way to definitively say whether there is or isn't. But I think either way that he's probably right that at least the majority of this decrease that the UAVs picked up on is probably because of all of those other factors. A good comment.
Okay, well that ends the questions we have. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, we'll give everybody a minute to jump in.
Sure. And if anybody has questions that they want to ask later, I've got my email up here. So.
Okay. David H says, but this would be more applicable to maize. I think referring to the shrinkage. Due to sorghum panicles being primarily the max and 95th percentile.
Okay. Yeah. I think that could be true. I think if there's stalk shrinkage, it could affect either crop, but as far as which crop would be affected more by it, if it even happens, I think a study would have to be done to see if both crops are affected or which one's affected more, etc.
Okay, so you highlighted a lot of unknowns and observations, which is really interesting because I don't think you spend as much time highlighting those in the paper as you do in a seminar, and I think that's sort of typical of the two different types of presentation styles. It really goes to show that there's a lot of unknown things going on in this type of work. So of all of those things that are unknown, what finding was the most surprising? And we'll leave out the stalk shrinkage issue because I think we've already covered that.
I think the most surprising thing is just, so I had a hunch that the UAVs would perform well, but I was actually kind of surprised by how much better they performed early on than the ground truth measurements in sorghum. I'm coming at that from a sorghum viewpoint, obviously, because that's what I work in primarily. But as far as our crop, that was what surprised me quite a bit. So I think judging by those results, using the UAS is a pretty real possibility.
So Justin asks, were there issues with lodging? And was the UAV able to identify lodging?
So in our tests, there wasn't really a major problem with lodging. I think you might have had a few plots here and there, maybe in the early generation material, especially since that was taller sometimes. But we didn't have an ongoing problem with it. If you wanted to identify it, though, it's actually really quite easy to find plots that lodged using UAV imagery. Also, if you see a really drastic reduction in height that doesn't make any sense, that could be because of lodging. And like I said, lodging maybe of individual plants could have contributed to that decrease in height towards the end of the season. So,
sure. And I'll point out too that there was some lodging in the maize plots in Corpus Christi, and Michael Sterrick's group, who's one of the co-authors on the paper, and Tencheng Chu actually published a paper looking at some of those issues. So, and I'm sure others have as well. So Jeff Mullen mentions, and I don't think you did cover this. What do you know what the UAV altitude was and the pixel capability of the UAS you used?
I'm not sure about the pixel capability. I know the altitude of the one in College Station was, I think, 25 meters. I'm not sure about Corpus. I would have to go back and check. But
yeah, you were talking about the rotary wing, though. It was rotary wing, so
yeah, I'm talking about the rotary wing.
Yeah, 25 to 30 meters.
And then there was the other two were also used, the Solo and the EB.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, good questions. Other questions? Oh, Sindhuja Sankaran asks, what was the variability within a plot? Do you think UAS captured more variability within the plot than ground truthing data?
So in the Maize and the advanced sorghum tests, to my knowledge, there wasn't very much variation within a plot, because those were hybrid material that was far along in the breeding process. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Murray, but I don't think there was very much variability within the maize. I know there wasn't within the advanced sorghum tests. But the early generation test did have some variation within plot. It had a few plots that were actually segregating for height still. So to answer your question, I think that the UAV probably picked up on that intra-plot variation and probably just create an aggregate estimate. So whether or not that's useful for a researcher is, I think it depends on what you're trying to do. But for the most part, you would want to have a measurement of things that were short within the plot and tall. So in that case, the UAV kind of gives you an estimate between the two, which might not be as useful. So that is one reason that I think further studies should start looking at being able to tease out variation within a plot, because then you could actually try to take out maybe plants that are taller than the rest of the plot.
Well, and I think you mentioned too in your conclusions that you're really interested in getting at intra-plot variation, and
yeah,
I think the ground truth data for that is going to be one of the biggest challenges, because I know you were manually out there taking this ground truth data, and I mean, how much fun was it to take it on 200 plots throughout the growing season?
Yeah, it's not fun, and it's very labor intensive. So I agree that the ground truthing for a study like that would be pretty involved. It would probably require a little bit of creative design.
So there's a question on your thoughts on errors in creating mosaic imagery.
in general, or
I think so. I think what Jeff's trying to get at here is, you know, when you take the images and you mosaic them, you've seen distortions and issues. How much does that affect your results?
well, I guess in this study we didn't necessarily quantify that, because if you have an error when you're creating your orthomosaic, it's going to be something that is going to factor into your eventual measurements. And we would see that when we start trying to conduct correlations or variation explained. As far as how much it can impact, I think it depends on the level of the error and the amount of errors you have. But I think that actually could be another study also, trying to look at, how much the small errors in the original imagery can actually impact later height estimates. That was actually a bit outside the purview of what we did.
But as you cite in the paper, there are other groups of those authors who have published additional papers focusing on the same data set, but from a UAV development perspective, and you were focused more on the aspect of plant breeding. So you might also refer people to those papers.
That's also a good point. Yeah.
Raghu, I hope I'm pronouncing people's names here correctly. Asked, are there comparisons between forage and grain sorghum to explain variation using UAVs? Would you expect the same trend for forage sorghum?
So we do have another test that we're going to be looking at, which is a biomass test. So that's also a very tall sorghum. But as far as actual forage material, we haven't really looked at that yet with the UAVs. But I would expect it to work pretty well in that material also, just like in the early generation, because the height of various forage lines can be pretty variable compared to the advanced sorghum tests, where the height wasn't very variable at all. So I would expect the results to look sort of similar to the early generation. And that's just me, just kind of with an educated guess. So I would expect UAVs to work well, is what I would say to sum that up.
Okay. I think that's all the questions that I have in the chat window. Anybody else? Any last questions? Feel free to unmute your microphone and hop in. Okay, hearing none, give Ace a round of applause, and thank you for submitting your journal to a society publication. Again, that article is online now, as is our next month's speaker, and we look forward to everybody joining us in February on the first Monday of the month. So thank you, Ace, and great job, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.